First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming. This seminar is about what exactly is fake news. And it's hosted by Mediacheck, which is a non-political, nonprofit organization dedicated in order to help educate people on why it's important to not spread fake news, what fake news is, and kind of fight misinformation. The seminar will go over 3 separate sections. The first one being what is fake news, which is basically talking about how to identify fake news versus biased news, and some, facts about it. The second section is how to avoid fake news. How, even though we know how to identify it, how do we avoid it? How do we stop the spread? As well as how to avoid, if possible, biased news. And then the third section is basically an interactive section called Real or Fake, where we show you different news articles and see whether or not you can determine whether or not it's real news article that looks fake or a fake news article that looks real. And this is encompassed in a Kahoot. And at the end of Kahoot, there's also a survey to see what you learned, as well as some feedback that we can get. And that being said, I just wanted to introduce myself and the other speaker. My name is Karen Law. I am the president and founder of Mediacheck, and I generally lean more towards the left on a democratic type view. I don't know too much about economics or the logistical side of politics, but I am very grounded in a humanitarian view.
And hi, I'm Alex. I'm Mediacheck's Director of Education. There's no really specific political party I'm affiliated with, but as far as the 4 mainstream parties go, the Green Party is probably the closest, so I put that there as well. All right, so I'll be doing segment 1. What is fake news? This is probably pretty self-explanatory to a lot of people that, fake news is news that's fake. It's kind of in the name, but there's a few more details that we should get into, I guess. Okay, so this is obviously fake. It's, some of you might recognize even the green and white color scheme to be from The Onion, and a lot of people think that fake news is easy to recognize and that it's obvious that it's being made up, but oftentimes this isn't the case. This article, for example, can easily be proven as fake news because you can physically prove that there's not a sinkhole in the Capitol building right now, and that we can physically fact check with a lot of outlets, but in many other cases, it's not so easy to tell. All right, so case in point, on the left, Pope Francis shocks world, endorses Donald Trump for president, releases statement. This obviously is fake news, but it's still old news and it still stands as fake. The headline looks pretty real. Everything surrounding the article seems legitimate, but it's much harder to verify because it's hearsay. It's someone reporting on what Pope Francis said, which doesn't have a physical record and can be a lot more difficult. Is there a problem with screen sharing? Okay, right, so continuing on with this, basically, it's a lot harder to verify things like what people said or like what individual figures do, because there's so many things that people do and it's very hard to document all of it. In this case, it's still fake news because Pope Francis has spoken out against Donald Trump a lot of times, and multiple media outlets have ran specific articles debunking this. However, this was one of the most shared fake news stories during the 2016 election cycle, making it stand as a piece of fake news that a large portion of America actually believed. So this reviews a few key problems on the right, and there's some numbers to back it up from the Pew Research Center. First is that 23% of Americans go on and share fake news. In this room, probably 2 or 3 people here might accidentally share fake news or even maliciously do so, but it's very hard to tell. We're mainly talking about people who are accidentally sharing fake news because people who maliciously do so, this seminar probably won't convince you for anything, but it does reveal a large problem where if so much news being spread, especially on social media, is fake, how can we reliably tell what's real news and what isn't? Which brings us to the second statistic, which is that around 60% of people, which is the majority of the US, doesn't trust mainstream media coverage. Whether this is, because of fake news or because people think mainstream media is biased, both are significant issues that the seminar seeks to address. And we'll see later that even if all news is biased, which it is, and there's still ways to reduce the bias in the news you get in your life. And finally, this 54% statistic is that election day news, 54% of it was fake in 2020. Most fake news obviously is political because it's difficult to verify. You can have a very specific purpose for doing so. And especially during high stakes political events like the US 2020 election, it becomes more evident since more people have motives to spread fake news. This is evident here because claims of election fraud and the quote unquote like big lie was extremely widespread in the weeks coming before the election as well as following it, surrounding things like voting, mail-in ballots, as well as the legitimacy of either candidate, meaning that especially during elections, you have to look at a lot of news sources to verify what you're seeing is real or fake. Next slide, please. All right, so as mentioned before, lack of trust in media has been perpetuated not just by fake news, but because of constant media bias, and you'll see that there's a difference. First is biased news, which is what you're more likely to see, because all news is biased to some degree, with some worse than others. On the right, it says news is heavily biased against Obama and in favor of Rodney, with a sad Obama face trying to exemplify that Obama's a failing president with the big impact font wording. All of this goes to psychologically affect the person reading the news to think that Obama's doing a bad job. I chose an older president just because, we're a bit more detached from it, I think. But in this case, you can definitely tell that it's heavily biased. Even if what's being reported within the news article may not be fake per se. On the other hand, you can see what fake news is. This might actually seem a bit less extreme than the biased news article saying that Obama signs an XO banning the national anthem in all sporting events with a bunch of patriotic looking people. This may look even more credible than the biased news, but you can tell it's fake. In this case, because it's usually misleading and false and has a politically charged message to create the same effect as heavily biased news. In either case, both go on to sort of affect people's perceptions about news, meaning that it's important to recognize not just news that's fake, but news that may have a political slant as well. Next slide, please. All right. This is the Ad Fontes media bias chart. Some of you probably have seen it before. It's one of the most iconic charts for determining bias. This can be found on the Mediacheck website, as well as an all slides media bias chart, so you can see how different analyses for media bias can come to different conclusions. This is basically because even these media bias charts have some level of bias because they're made up of journalists who document these things. But here's how it goes. The higher up in the chart vertically is the more factual it is. For example, AP, Reuters, and UPI don't actually do commentary or opinion pieces. They just report the news as is. Whereas, say, InfoWars or a Palmer report primarily focus on, opinion pieces, as well as heavily biased or even fake news. And obviously, there's a lot of websites that are completely comprised of fake news that aren't even on this chart because they can't be considered news. This chart isn't conclusive and it isn't complete, but it gives you a good idea of how, as news becomes more biased on both the extreme left and the extreme right, it becomes a lot harder to determine whether news is fake or real because there's more of an intent to create a political message in that case. So in this case, Ad Fontes is pretty reliable. It sources 300 news sources with 30 analysts to rate articles. And all of these analysts will take a political bias test on 18 policies and will employ journalists across the political spectrum. There's a focus on information because from their website, it's, quote, not strictly traditional news sources, but because so much of the information people use to make decisions in their life is not exactly news. And as we'll see in the next segment, which is, right now, most news is biased, and we have to figure out how we can counter that.
That being said, the biggest problem we have is how to avoid fake news and how to avoid biased news. And for fake news specifically, it's actually very easy because fake news itself is very easy to spot. And here's specifically why. There are three main points that I wanted to take out. The first one is that, well, it does look a little bit odd. If an article or website itself looks off, then you do want to reconsider whether or not what's on that article or website is actually true information. And what does this mean? It's not exactly like what schools teach us. It's not just based off how the URL matters, or if it ends with .gov or .org, or whether or not like there's specific steps. It's not exactly like that. Let's say, for example, the most popular news sources, such as the Associated Press, should be more valued than smaller, unheard of news sites because they have this sort of reputation. They've been doing news for a long time, and versus some smaller news source that no one's ever heard of, it doesn't have that credibility. News sites that show an author's credentials, who the authors are, and back up their articles with hyperlinks to different articles and different studies are more reliable than articles that are not, because they show where the reliability does come from. And this one that may sound a little bit stupid, but if a site doesn't look too aesthetically pleasing, it might not be trustworthy. This is because most reliable sites will be organized and have some sort of theme that would have some sort of look that most of the time is aesthetically pleasing. You can take any major news source for that case, Associated Press, NBC, Washington Post. They all have some sort of theme that is somewhat aesthetically pleasing. And one part of this aesthetic is whether or not they include ads. Most news sources do include ads, but where those ads are and how they are placed can determine whether or not a source is reliable. This is because sources that aren't reliable will often have ads all over the place. They would have more ads than sources that are reliable because they need to make more money given they aren't really reliable sources. The next step is very simple. Just Google it. If something looks off, then you should always Google it. This is because Google is your friend. There is no secret algorithm that feeds you liberal news to brainwash you, regardless of what some sources might say. The way the Google algorithm works is that on the first page, the most popular, most relevant, and most viewed sources would be first. And sometimes if you don't see what's on the first few pages, then the information that you got might not necessarily be true. And even if you did find one news source, maybe after looking for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, that doesn't necessarily mean that your information is true if it takes you that long to only find one extra news source to back up your opinion, and you have to filter through a bunch of different keywords to be able to find it. And finally, social media is a super spreader. Super spreader is a word I feel like everyone here has heard of, especially with COVID, but especially with misinformation, it's very true. Misinformation spread widely through social media platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. An MIT study found that false news stories are 70% more likely to be retweeted than true news stories are. And the fact is, it's not just Twitter. Echo spaces on Facebook or story reposts on Instagram cause fake news to be spread faster, practically tenfold. And logically, this makes sense from a viewer's point of view. You see something interesting, like the sinkhole article in the beginning of the seminar, and you think, wow, that's very interesting. And you think that your friends should hear about it. You repost it, and then your friends repost it, and then their friends repost it. And now, for some apparent reason, all your friends think that the Capitol building got swallowed by a sinkhole. Obviously, most of the time when fake news is spread, it's not that ridiculous, but in many cases, the cycle is still very true. However, the opposite can be said about reliable news on social media. Many social media outlets have many news outlets have social media accounts where they share news articles and information. It's mostly just a brief introduction and a photo, but if that's the only way you're getting news, it's better to follow those accounts rather than fake news accounts. And reading news from accurate sources is just kind of the start to preventing fake news and the spread of misinformation. It's not a problem that we can solve overnight or even in a year or with a small amount of people. But there are things that you can do to stop the spread. So what are they? Well, the first one I think is fairly simple. You just have to stop and think. Applying the skills that we learned on how to identify fake news in the previous slide into your daily life. The reason why fake news spread isn't some mysterious force, it's people who are reposting and sharing those stories. You just take a few seconds to stop when you read something that you think maybe is a little bit off, and you see whether or not it's real or fake. And if it's real news, then great. But if it's not, then you might want to mentally note that this source has spat out fake news and it is an unreliable source. It really is that simple. And in some cases, maybe someone you know, or maybe a celebrity has posted fake news, someone that you might have trusted. But in that case, then you might want to double think whether or not that celebrity is someone that you could necessarily trust. The second part is research. After you stop and think, then you might want to research to see whether or not the news source you get is accurate and reliable. This is basically the same thing as Googling it. And the things that you do want to research, we've kind of gone over in the previous slide. It's author credentials, whether or not the topic has more than one source, whether or not the source is a reliable source, and really how many people truly believe that source. And what I mean by how many people truly believe that source information is, if you take a group of 1,000 people, you give them an article and time to see whether or not that source is real, and maybe let's say 50 people in that group say that this is real news, maybe it's not real news. In fact, it's more than likely that if a considerable amount of people deem something fake news, it is most likely to be fake news. But again, people's opinions are very iffy. Places to go, though, if you want to see whether or not the news you get is real or fake, there are fact-checking organizations that actually do fact-check information on a daily basis. One of these would be factcheck.org, which is very popular, and they do real-time fact-checking on information. And again, reliable popular news medias very often, more times than not, do not have fake news on them. That's being Washington Post, NBC, ABC, etc. And the third and final part is to inform others. Even if you don't spread fake news, other people around you will. So very simple, stop them. If someone already posted fake news, you can tell them that it's fake and maybe send them a few links and research to prove that what they had just posted is actually fake news. And if you see something that is fake news, then don't repost it. And even if you do repost it, you should probably mention that what you're reposting is fake news. Or what you could do is that you could tell them before they even post fake news. Explain the steps that you've just learned or you've just listened to and the tricks to avoid it, and tell someone who often spread fake news or follow fake news websites, and tell them why spreading it is very harmful. Now, that being said, a lot of what I've just explained regarding fake news does apply to biased news, but is slightly different. So, given what I've just said, how do we avoid biased news? It's a question that I think everyone here has. It's a question that's been argued for years, and people often say there's just one right answer. You just don't read biased news, but it's actually not that simple. And to prove this, I actually talked with a journalist, and Haley, she's currently a retired journalist who worked at the Orange County Register for over 30 years. She works in both digital and online news and what saw the transition of this fake news era and this digital era. And I've given a clip that provides more insight on a journalist perspective on this news, and specifically biased news itself. If someone, just kind of a heads up, if you can't hear the audio, can someone kind of tell me in chat so I know? But other than that,
well, everybody has biases. I mean, I do, you do, everybody does. People read the news through the lenses of their own biases. So a really common experience that I had throughout my 4 decades in journalism, and that every other journalist I know does too, is that you could post a story or publish a story, and you would immediately have several online comments about it saying, well, this isn't true because I believe X. And then you would have people from the other side of the issue say, well, this isn't true because I believe Y. And I always figured I'd done my job right if I had about an equal number of people from each side saying they didn't believe it for opposite reasons, right? Because then it was balanced out. So there are always people who are going to say that they don't believe something. The latest way of saying you don't believe something or that you disagree with something is to call it fake news, which is just the latest buzzword for that. But people always have perceived news and information through the lens of their own set of beliefs and their own assumptions and their own biases. That's always been true. It's become more contentious within the past, I think, 5 or 6 years. And I think that there are reasons for that. I think that, that has to do with people in the public sphere promoting the idea that you can be more contentious about it. Whereas maybe 20 years ago, it just wasn't considered a polite thing to do, so people didn't do it as much.
If you want to see the full interview, it's on our website, mediachecknonprofit.com, and you can check it out after the seminar. But what I think what she does say, I think, is very important, that media is biased. So we have this idea, is like, can we avoid fake news? No. Well, kind of. There are 5 points here. The first is that everyone has bias. There's not a single person in this world that has no bias, and I'm willing to bet on this. Why is because everyone's situation is different. We're biased towards what helps us. We're biased against what doesn't. And that's why we talked about our political biases in the beginning of the seminar. We want to stress that although this seminar is going through, we researched, we're trying to give a non-political, non-biased opinion. Regardless, there will be some bias in it because that's naturally who we are. It's an unavoidable thing to do. And this is something very important to note, because when you talk to someone about politics, news, information, no matter what, there will always be some sort of bias behind it, whether it's intended or whether it's not intended at all. But this isn't necessarily a bad thing, and I'll kind of explain that more later in the later section of this slide. The second thing, though, is journalism bias or journalist bias. Journalists are not exempt from personal bias, but this is the important part. They always do try to deliver facts and information because they are journalists. It kind of reflects the idea of what the First Amendment is, the freedom of press, and what that entails, to be able to keep the government in check, to give people information freely. And I want to talk about this idea of a journalism code of ethics. It's basically this code that's provided by the Society of Professional Journalists, the Society of Professional Journalists. It has 4 subsections that go through what a journalist should and shouldn't do to be able to abide by a code of ethics. And the most important one is to seek the truth and report it. This is like a direct quote, and it says, ethical journalism should be accurate and fair. Journalists should be honest, courageous in gathering, reporting, and interpreting information. And although I know it seems like journalism today doesn't follow those ethics, that's actually far from the truth. We can see that even sources such as CNN and Fox News do actually report on the facts. And I'm not talking about like the opinion side of things where they go strictly into their own opinions, but I'm talking about the news source organizations themselves. They actually do report on the facts. Granted, that news is skewed news, but it does give accurate report on what happened in an event. But this is where we go into the third section, in being careful. Although journalists do report on the facts, we still do have to be careful. And this is because listening and watching to only one side or one source of information of biased news can and will affect what you think and believe. And even if you truly want to see the world in a bipartisan view, you need to get the full story. You need to read all sides. You need to read the liberal side, you need to read the conservative side, you need to read the moderate side. But it's okay if you don't. And this is where I stress the most important thing, the most important takeaway from this entire seminar is to be aware. Even if you don't want to read news, or you just want to stick to the news source you have because you think it's reliable, or if you've learned nothing from this seminar, if you just completely zoned out, this is the one thing that I think I kind of want to hard hit, is to be aware. You understand that the news you read is biased. Understand that what you're reading has biasness and there is some sort of motive against that. Understand that other people have different opinions than you, and understand that your opinion may not be the 100% right opinion. No one has the 100% right answer to every single problem in the world. If it was, I guarantee there would be world peace right now. But acknowledging that you may be wrong, that the people and things that you normally align with might be wrong, and the information that you read might not be the full story, is the best thing that a person can do. A lot of people lack this idea of awareness. They think that they're right 100% of the time, even though that necessarily isn't the case. And it is okay to have different opinions or not read information from media that you disagree with an opinion, only if you understand that what you're reading is biased and it's not 100% accurate indication of the information or events that took place. And when you are aware, this is kind of where the personal, where it's not necessarily a bad thing that everyone has their own political biasness, is when you're aware, you're able to talk to someone who has opposing views, and you're able to kind of learn and expand on your views in that way. Humans necessarily were built to be able to critically think. We're able to evolve to that point to talk to others, but how are we supposed to talk to other people if we refuse to acknowledge they might be right, if we refuse to acknowledge that we're wrong? And that's why there's a lot of miscommunication and arguments that happen, because people aren't aware, because they're not listening to people that disagree and thinking they might be right, I might be wrong. And finally, the last point is that it really isn't that hard. I can 100% guarantee to you that mass media doesn't have this political agenda to take over the world. And even if there was something like that, it's literally impossible for it to have gone unnoticed. You would have to have hundreds of thousands of people agree on one thing to be able to do the same thing without any sort of whistleblower whatsoever. And we've seen that impossible with the different organizations themselves. Because for some reason, misinformation and biased news seems to be this convoluted web that just doesn't end. And in reality, that's not true. It's just a knot. It might be a difficult knot, but anyone can untie it if they really try. All the sources, news articles, statistics, studies, and the millions of people who are commenting on those information are there. You just have to look for it. You just have to access it. And again, there really isn't some big bad that wants to control the world through social media. It doesn't exist. It's really just not there. And I think that's pretty much covered everything we wanted to talk about. in the seminar. So I'll kind of give it back to Alex on real or fake.
All right, so 2 warm-up rounds before the Kahoot. Real and fake news can be a bit hard to discern, and I know this isn't a perfect representation since most of determining fake and real news is based on your additional research, but here's if you can tell if it's real or fake based on the headline alone. All right. So okay, Karen, you can move on, and whether it's real or fake, you can private message to me or put it in the chat, do whatever you want. In this case, it's the US military could lose Space Force trademark to Netflix series. This news is real, and it's about a 50-50 split. We had 3 people say it's real and 2 people say it's fake. Actually, there was a Netflix series called Space Force, and the US Army almost got sued for it. So this is real. In this case, you can tell from the headline alone that there are some indications that it might be real. Having an author with a cited name, a publication date, as well as social media on the site are all indications that they're not afraid to show what they have. But in this case, it's real. Obviously, there are fake newses that have all of these things, so it does require additional research. But given the general aesthetic of it, you can tell that to some degree it's probably reliable. All right, let's move on to the next one. All right, so this is from the American Independent, and it says, White House threatens to fire anyone who tries to quit. Let's say 30 seconds, real or fake. All right, looks like everyone answered already. Joshua, you're on a roll. This is real. So yeah, trick question. We called it real or fake, but gave you 2 real news sources. In this case, it's very hard to tell whether it's real or not because it looks like fake news. And this is why we need to emphasize that even if you think news might seem fake or real, you need to do more research beyond just the surface level. In this case, author, date, and then those are all reliable things you can look at, but it does look fake. This is a very, inciting headline, but when Trump was threatened to be impeached, some of his cabinet members, as well as officials in the White House, were going to testify against them and then resign, and he threatened to fire them before they can do so. So this is something that actually happened. Do keep in mind that the American Independent is not a reliable news source, however. So while this is real news, it is heavily biased. And in this case, I believe it has a right-wing bias. So do keep that in mind. So I guess people who put fake, they're half right. We can move on to the Kahoot though.